He once demanded to know the exact number of men his girlfriend had ever slept with, refused to let the subject drop for an entire evening, and then couldn't actually handle the answer once he finally got it. Not because the number itself mattered as much as he claimed. Because Ross Geller has never quite believed he could be enough for someone without constant, exhausting proof that no one else could ever compare. Ross Geller never needed to know who came before him. He needed to stop fearing that someone better was always still out there. Welcome back to the Character Couch. I've rewatched this show enough times to wince before his jealousy even fully kicks in, and for years I saw Ross the same way most people do, the neurotic, overly possessive boyfriend who ruins his own relationships. But you don't just see a man with a jealousy problem. You see someone whose entire sense of worth depends so heavily on being chosen and staying chosen that any hint of comparison feels like evidence he's already losing. By the end of this video, every jealous outburst Ross Geller has ever had is going to sound a lot less like insecurity for its own sake, and a lot more like a man bracing for a loss he's already convinced himself is coming. There's a term for what Ross experiences. Psychologists describe insecure attachment as a relational pattern where someone struggles to trust that a partner's love is stable or permanent, leading to hypervigilance, jealousy, and a compulsive need for reassurance that rarely satisfies the underlying anxiety for long. It isn't really about the specific partner or the specific threat. It's about a nervous system that has learned, somewhere early, that being loved doesn't guarantee being kept. Ross doesn't interrogate his girlfriend's pasts because he genuinely needs the information. He does it because some part of him has never fully believed the relationship is safe from ending, regardless of how good it currently is. Ross grows up as, by most accounts, the more academically celebrated Geller child, praised consistently for his intelligence and achievements in a household where his sister Monica often received considerably harsher, more critical treatment by comparison. On the surface, that dynamic should have given Ross a stable, secure sense of his own worth. But look closer at what actually earned that praise. Ross's parents, particularly his mother Judy, consistently framed their affection around achievement, grades, career milestones, being the smart one, rather than around Ross simply being loved unconditionally regardless of performance. That's a subtly different message than it first appears. Being valued conditionally, even favorably, still teaches a child that love has to be continuously earned and re-earned, rather than something reliably guaranteed regardless of what happens next. That conditional foundation, love contingent on continued success, becomes the exact template Ross carries into every romantic relationship, starting with the marriage that would end in the most destabilizing way imaginable. Ross's first marriage ends when his wife, Carol, realizes she's gay and leaves him for another woman, a rejection that goes beyond ordinary heartbreak into something considerably more destabilizing for someone already prone to insecurity. It isn't simply that Carol left. It's that her departure seemed to confirm something Ross may have already privately feared, that he wasn't simply insufficiently loved, but fundamentally, categorically not what she actually needed at all. That specific flavor of rejection, being left not for another man but for an entirely different kind of partner altogether, leaves Ross with a particular wound that ordinary breakups don't typically produce. It isn't just, "You don't love me anymore." It's closer to, "You were never going to be enough," structurally, regardless of what you did. For someone whose sense of worth already depended heavily on achievement and continued proof of value, that kind of rejection lands with unusual force. That wound doesn't heal quickly, and it shapes nearly every relationship Ross builds afterward, starting with the woman who becomes his most significant, most tumultuous romance. Carol's partner, Susan, remains a constant presence in Ross's life throughout the series, given their shared custody of their son Ben, forcing Ross to regularly confront the specific person his ex-wife chose over him. Their relationship is tense, occasionally petty, and rarely entirely resolved, a lingering reminder Ross can't simply avoid or move past cleanly. That ongoing proximity to Susan matters psychologically. Most people recovering from a painful divorce eventually get some emotional distance from their ex's new partner. Ross never fully gets that distance, forced instead into recurring contact with living proof of the rejection that first taught him love could be conditional and reversible. That repeated exposure likely reinforces, rather than resolves, his underlying insecurity about being fundamentally replaceable. That insecurity finds its most dramatic, most consuming expression in the relationship the show spends a full decade developing. Ross's on and off relationship with Rachel becomes the show's central romance, marked by genuine connection alongside some of Ross's most damaging jealous behavior, including the infamous dispute over whether they were on a break when Ross slept with someone else. That moment, endlessly debated by viewers, reveals something more specific than simple miscommunication. Ross's underlying belief that any ambiguity in the relationship meant it was probably already over, so he'd rather act on that assumption than risk being the one left behind again. His jealousy throughout their relationship, obsessing over Rachel's coworker Mark, demanding reassurance repeatedly, springs from the same wound Carol left behind, a conviction that eventually, inevitably, someone better will come along and Rachel will realize she can do better than him. That fear doesn't respond well to reassurance, because it isn't really about Rachel's actual feelings. It's about Ross's own deep uncertainty that he could ever be considered enough on a permanent basis. That same insecurity doesn't disappear during his relationship with Rachel. It resurfaces almost immediately in the marriage he enters shortly after their breakup. Ross's whirlwind marriage to Emily, a British woman he meets and marries within a remarkably short time frame, collapses spectacularly when he accidentally says Rachel's name during the wedding vows themselves. The incident is played largely for comedy, but it reveals something important. Ross's own unresolved feelings and insecurities were operating beneath the surface of a relationship he'd entered, partly perhaps, as a way to prove to himself that he could move on completely and be chosen fully by someone new. Emily's understandable devastation and her subsequent ultimatum demanding Ross cut off contact with Rachel entirely puts Ross in an impossible position that ultimately ends the marriage. What's notable is how little Ross seems to have processed his actual feelings before entering that marriage, rushing toward a fresh commitment rather than sitting with the insecurity Carol and Rachel had already left him carrying. That pattern, rushing toward reassurance rather than examining the underlying fear, becomes visible again in a friendship where Ross competes for status in ways that go beyond simple camaraderie. Ross's friendship with Chandler, dating back to college, is one of the most stable relationships in his life, but it occasionally reveals Ross's competitive insecurities in a lower-stakes setting. Ross frequently needs to be recognized as the more successful, more intellectually accomplished friend, sometimes bringing up his doctorate or his museum position in contexts that don't particularly call for it. That need for recognition, even among close friends who clearly already respect him, suggests Ross's insecurity isn't confined only to romantic relationships. It extends into a broader need to be seen as accomplished and valuable across every relationship in his life, a pattern consistent with someone whose childhood taught him that value had to be continuously demonstrated rather than simply assumed. Chandler rarely takes this personally, absorbing Ross's occasional need for validation with characteristic humor rather than resentment, which makes their friendship one of the few relationships where Ross's insecurity doesn't cause lasting damage. Ross's relationship with his sister Monica carries its own complicated history, shaped by the same parental dynamic that favored Ross throughout their childhood. While Ross received consistent academic praise, Monica often endured harsher treatment and body-related criticism from their parents, a contrast both siblings remain aware of well into adulthood. That imbalance means Ross occasionally has to reckon with his own role in a family dynamic that clearly disadvantaged Monica, even though he didn't create that unfairness himself. Their adult relationship shows genuine affection and loyalty, but also an underlying awareness, on both sides, of how differently their parents' conditional love actually treated each of them. That family dynamic, however, extends beyond just the Geller household, reflecting a broader cultural moment around achievement-based parenting that shaped an entire generation. To understand Ross fully, it helps to understand the broader parenting culture of the era he grew up in. Middle-class American parenting during the 1970s and 1980s increasingly emphasized measurable achievement, grades, test scores, career trajectory as primary markers of a child's worth, often with less cultural emphasis on unconditional emotional validation compared to more contemporary parenting approaches. Ross's parents' consistent praise for his academic success reflects that broader cultural framework more than any unique failing specific to the Geller household. An entire generation of children raised within that achievement-oriented model absorbed a similar lesson, that being loved and being accomplished were closely, perhaps inseparably, linked. Ross's later need for continuous validation in relationships mirrors, in adult romantic form, exactly the conditional approval structure that culture modeled for him throughout childhood. There's a second layer of context worth examining. Popular culture and relationship norms in the 1990s often still treated jealousy as a somewhat acceptable, even romantic, expression of caring deeply about a partner, rather than recognizing it as a warning sign of deeper insecurity requiring examination. Media of the era frequently depicted possessive behavior as a byproduct of passionate love, rather than a red flag worth addressing directly. That cultural framing gave Ross's jealousy a kind of social cover it might not receive as readily today. His behavior toward Rachel, while genuinely damaging to their relationship, wasn't necessarily read by the broader culture surrounding the show as clearly unhealthy, softening any external pressure Ross might have otherwise faced to examine and address his underlying insecurity more directly. Ross's relationship with his son Ben, born from his marriage to Carol, offers a rare space where Ross's usual insecurities largely don't apply. Ben's love for his father isn't contingent on achievement or comparison to anyone else. It's simply present, uncomplicated by the anxieties that dominate Ross's romantic relationships. That uncomplicated bond matters. It suggests Ross is fully capable of experiencing secure, unconditional connection when the relationship doesn't carry the specific romantic stakes that trigger his deeper fears about being replaceable. Fatherhood offers him something his childhood conditional love and his adult romantic disappointments rarely have: a relationship where he doesn't have to continuously prove his worth to remain loved. Ross's friendship with Joey, while less examined than his bond with Chandler, offers another lower-stakes relationship where Ross's insecurities occasionally surface but rarely cause lasting harm. Joey's straightforward, undemanding loyalty gives Ross a relationship where he doesn't need to compete or continuously prove his value, similar to the ease Chandler's friendship also provides. That contrast, ease in male friendships versus anxiety in romantic relationships, reinforces the specific nature of Ross's wound. His insecurity isn't a generalized inability to trust anyone. It's specifically activated by romantic commitment, the exact arena where Carol's departure first taught him that even genuine effort and love could still end in being left for someone else entirely. But here's the part that caught me completely off guard. Rachel Green, the one everyone frames as the primary victim of Ross's jealousy and possessiveness throughout their decade-long on and off relationship. She's also, and I cannot believe I'm saying this, someone who repeatedly used Ross's insecurity to her own advantage, keeping him uncertain enough to remain devoted while she worked through her own hesitations about full commitment. Think about it. Rachel benefits, more than once, from Ross's anxious need for her attention. From the museum dinosaur exhibit thrown together to impress her early on, to his repeated willingness to accommodate her career ambitions and personal growth at real cost to his own stability. His constant, anxious effort to remain chosen isn't just something Rachel tolerates. It's something her own ambivalence about commitment occasionally relies on, keeping Ross close and invested while she takes her time deciding what she actually wants. So the woman everyone assumes was simply enduring Ross's jealousy all those years was also, at points, quietly benefiting from exactly the anxious devotion that jealousy sprang from, without either of them ever fully naming that dynamic while it was happening. What Ross deserved, back in a childhood where love arrived attached to achievement, and in a marriage that ended for reasons no amount of effort could have changed, was proof that being chosen didn't require constant, exhausting vigilance to maintain. Not a tally of Rachel's past relationships, demanded and then immediately regretted. Not a marriage rushed into as proof he could be loved fully by someone new. What he actually received was an early lesson that love had to be earned continuously, followed by a rejection that seemed to confirm his worst fear, that he could do everything right and still, somehow, not be enough. He built an entire relational pattern around bracing for loss, so abandonment could never quite catch him by surprise again. He built it so well, he nearly cost himself the one relationship that might have actually lasted, simply by refusing to believe it safely could. And in Ben's simple, unconditional love, in a friendship with Joey and Chandler that never once required him to prove anything, that was the boy still waiting to be enough without having to earn it. Finally, quietly, discovering that some love just already was. The jealousy was never about the jealousy. It never was. So was Ross Geller simply a jealous boyfriend or a man terrified of being left again? Neither, honestly. Ross wasn't a naturally possessive man who happened to have bad luck in love, and he wasn't a wounded man merely performing jealousy for dramatic effect. He was someone who turned a childhood of conditional praise, and a marriage that ended for reasons entirely outside his control, into a permanent, exhausting vigilance against a loss he'd already convinced himself was inevitable. Maybe that's truer of more of us than we'd like to admit. Sometimes the person who can't stop checking whether they're still loved isn't doubting their partner at all. He's still trying to prove something to a much younger version of himself who never got to simply believe it was true. So here's what I want to know. If Carol had never left, do you think Ross still becomes a man this consumed by jealousy? Or was that fear always going to find him somewhere, given the childhood that taught him love had to be earned in the first place? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more of these deep dives into the characters you thought you already understood, hit subscribe. The couch is always open,